Hey everybody, and in this video I'm going to update one of my older videos with an improved process for digitizing 35mm film with an APS-C, specifically in this case DSLR. The principle here will work on a full frame or micro four thirds, and at the end of the video I'll explain why the process that I'm showing you works and also give you a guide on how to figure out what gear you need for your specific setup. So here's what we need basically. I'll move the lamp out of the way for now, but we need a macro bellows with a slide copier, which is that bit right above it, macro tubes, an enlarger lens specifically, I'll explain why at the end of this video, and a DSLR. Enlarger lenses have an M39 mount, so I have an M39 to M42 adapter ring and then an M42 to Pentax K adapter ring, because everything I'm going to be doing here is Pentax K. If you use a different system, just get an M42 adapter ring that is for your system after you get the M39 to M42 ring. So here's the enlarger lens. This is a Rotagon 80mm f4. It's an exceptionally good lens, and you can't go wrong if you want to go with a Rotagon for these. So we're going to put the M39 to M42 adapter ring on it once I get the threads in the raceways eventually, and then we're going to put the M42 adapter on it after it's tightened down a little bit, and then we'll mount it into the macro bellows. An important thing to notice here that will come into play in a minute is that this enlarger lens has a 40.5, that's 40.5 millimeter filter thread. Thankfully, it has a filter thread. That makes my life so much easier. If your enlarger lens does not have a filter thread, this is going to be a lot harder. So these are M42 macro tubes with a 40.5 to 49 step-up ring and then a 49 to 42 step-down. I could not find a single step-up ring at the time that I put this together that was 40.5 to 42. Now this is 42 to 49, which will need to attach it to the slide copier. To avoid hotspots in your digitizations, you need to felt line the macro tubes. That is mandatory. These El Cheapo 99-cent macro tubes are not light absorptive enough that they will not give you a bright spot in the middle of all of your digital images if you don't felt line them. So get some adhesive backed felt and cut it down to size. To set it up, we have the enlarger lens on the macro bellows. We're going to screw on these macro tubes. This process here, putting the macro tubes on, gives us improved contrast and sharpness in the digital files by cutting out all of the extraneous light that comes in from the sides. If you don't want to use macro bellows, or macro tubes rather, that's fine. You just need to do all of your digitization in the dark. Any stray light will rob you of contrast and reduce your digital file quality. Next, let's attach the slide copier. We'll take that little cap off the front there and put it in the holder, the box, for the enlarger lens so that it doesn't get lost. And then we're going to attach the slide copier to the front. One thing to make sure that you do before you really get going on this, clean the diffusing glass on your slide copier, both sides of it. Blow out the inside of your macro tubes with a compressed air duster if you can. Clean the front and rear surfaces of your enlarger lens if they need it, and definitely clean the sensor on your digital camera, because any dirt on the diffusing glass and on your sensor will reproduce in every single file that you make. Next thing you want to do is make sure that everything is roughly aligned horizontally. We're going to fine-tune that once we get the entire setup going and get the camera up and running. So once you have the slide copier on, with my bellows I have to take the adapter ring off. I can't directly mount the camera onto the bellows. And you're going to put the camera on the bellows, thumb tighten it a little bit so that you can adjust the camera slightly. You want to make sure that it's roughly level with the horizontal planes of your slide copier. Basically what you want to make sure of is that your negative and your sensor are horizontally aligned and vertically aligned, And if you do that, you're going to be able to reproduce the entire film negative onto your sensor if you have the right kind of lens in between your film and sensor. So here's how we're going to set the entire thing up. And normally I just sit on my couch when I do this, but well, I got to show you what I'm doing. So we're going to take the cord off the lamp, plug it in. We need some tin foil and some frog tape for this because we need to keep the light from the lamp out of our eyes. Now we're going to line up the copier with the light bulb. A note on the light bulb: get a full spectrum light bulb. If you have a partial spectrum or a cool temperature or warm temperature light bulb, it will affect the color trueness of slides. Not a big deal if you're only doing black and white, but if you want to do anything color, you definitely need a full spectrum light bulb. Alternately, you can sit outside if it's a nice day and point the front of the enlarger not at the sun, but into some clear sky. That's full spectrum, and that will do just as well also, and you don't have to set up a lamp. But if you're going to do it at night or whatever, you just don't want to be outside in the sun, this is a good solution and a good approach. The lamp's going to go literally right in front of the bellows, in front of the slide copier, because we don't want to lose any of that light. The more light we can get, the better. And that tin foil is going to direct a little bit more into the copier, but it's also, more importantly, as we're sitting behind the camera, it's going to keep stray light from shining in our eyes, which is unpleasant. Turn it on. Okay, that works. Now let's go behind the camera and see what it looks like. So we're going to insert the focal length. It's actually an 80mm lens, but there's no option for 80mm in this camera. So let's grab some film, and I have some black and white slide film here because I thought it would be easier to demonstrate with that than with black and white negative. We're going to feed it into the slide copier up at the front, and we're going to pull it through until we can see the first frame. It will be out of focus. That's fine right now. Now I'm going to show you here in just a second, picture-in-picture, roughly what I'm doing with this while I do it in the main screen. They're not synced up perfectly because I had to film them separately. Basically what you want to do is adjust your macro bellows in and out and your slide copier up and down until you have a rough focus on the entire frame. Next thing you're going to do is make sure that your enlarger lens is wide open, and with your lens being wide open, you can then start to focus on the negative. Zoom in all the way with your live focus, and that will allow you to basically treat your camera like a grain focuser and make sure you have accurate focus. Also, for those of you who shoot film, this, what you're looking at now, is called a data frame. I just enter the camera serial number, make, model, serial number, the lenses I'm going to use, the film type, the date, so on and so forth, so that when I look at the digital images of that film in the future, I know exactly what I was doing. Next, grab a little remote control, because if you hit the shutter button, you will introduce camera shake, and the remote control will let you eliminate shake in that process. So we're set up for remote use. And next, what we're going to do is take a picture, and also have your camera set in aperture priority mode and your enlarger lens stopped down at this point when you start taking the photos. And every time you take a photo, if your slide copier is clean enough, you can just pull the negatives through it without scratching them. So that's one thing you need to make sure of, is that your slide copier is very well maintained, so that you can just take your uncut strip of film and just slide it through and go picture, 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 picture. And with this approach, you can take raw files of your negatives very quickly. You can go through a 36 frame roll in just a minute or two. And if you have a lot of film, this is a really good way to do it in bulk and get raw files to edit, which gives you a ton of ability to edit. At the very end of this video, I'll show you what you can do with them. Here's why this works. An enlarger lens, in the way that it's designed, works opposite of a typical lens. Basically, with an enlarger lens, the light comes through the threaded end and goes out the front end. With a typical lens, the light comes in the front end and out the threaded or the mounting end. So basically, when we mount the enlarger lens so that the light comes through the front of it and goes out the threaded end, we're reverse mounting the enlarger lens. And if you think about reverse mounting a standard lens, it turns it into a macro lens. If you reverse mount a 50mm lens to do macro work, it makes everything in front of it very big. So when we reverse mount an enlarging lens, the same principle happens. It becomes a reducing lens. So when you need to reduce a 35mm negative to APS-C or micro four thirds, what you need to do is figure out the standard lens size for your film format. 35mm, that's a 50mm lens. Then you need to multiply that focal length by the crop factor to get to that film negative size versus the sensor you're using. So let's say that you are using APS-C. It has a 1.5x crop factor versus a 35mm negative. So we know that the 50mm lens is the standard. 50mm times 1.5 is 75mm. In order to reduce a 35mm negative to an APS-C sensor size, what we have to do is use at least a 75mm enlarging lens. This principle only applies to enlarging lenses because the flange focal distance for an enlarging lens is the same as its focal distance. So an 85mm enlarging lens or an 80mm would have an 80mm register distance or flange focal distance. Generally, that's measured from the optical center of the lens, with enlarger lenses, by the way. At any rate, the same applies if you're doing other formats. Let's say you have a 645 negative and a full frame DSLR. The crop factor between those is 1.7x. So if you want a standard enlarger lens for a 645 frame going from a negative to a print is 80mm. 80mm times 1.7 is 132, so you would need a 135mm enlarger lens and also a substantially longer bellows than I'm using in my setup to replicate a 645 negative onto a full frame sensor. If you're using a micro four thirds camera for 35mm, you would, and the crop factor on those is 2x, you would need a 100mm enlarger lens and also an appropriately longer macro bellows or some macro tubes at the back of your bellows to make up that distance. So just remember, with an enlarger lens used to digitize film in this way, you're using it backwards to make it a reducing lens. And that's why this technique needs a longer focal length enlarger lens than the actual cross section of the standard focal length lens for enlargement. If you're going full frame negative, 35mm negative to full frame sensor, you can then use a 50mm enlarger lens and you'll be a-okay in that regard. So let's take a look at some sample images here so you can see what is capable with this setup. And all of these were captured in RAW and edited in RAW. We'll do 5 black and white, then 5 color. The film type is in the upper left corner for each of these. All of them are 35mm except the Lomo Orca, which is 110. It's really easy to do 110 with this setup. You just feed it through and then crop out everything that's not in the frame. This first one here was taken in a very high contrast situation. Snowy day, sun over to the left, dark shadows on the train, and what it allows us to do, editing this in RAW, is dial back the highlights, which are blacks on the negative, of course, and increase the shadows, which are thinner areas, lighter areas of the negative. And so what we can see in this image is the snow on the hills. The sky is captured in white just because of the way the film works and the exposure particulars of this shot, but we can also get the shadows on the side of the train that's facing us. A way to set yourself up for success when doing this is to try to develop for flat negatives, low contrast negatives. You can always add contrast in post. It's very, very, very hard to take it away. So if you have a low contrast negative and a raw file to edit, you can really get all of the tones that you want in your black and white image. This next one here is the 110 negative, and just snapped it on a standard sunny day. And as you can see, there are some pretty harsh shadows to the left of the car. However, because this was a raw file, even though this is a tiny, tiny little negative on a very high contrast film, the shadow detail within the car itself, the front of each of the two wheels, the side of the car that's facing us, I was able to pull details out of that in post, editing the raw file, that I'm not even sure I could have gotten out of this were I editing or making a print in the darkroom and dodging and burning like crazy. This next one here is a high contrast film. This is an exceedingly high contrast film. And you can see there's places where the shadow detail are really lost. The climber's shorts, that rock in the center. However, a lot of the shadow detail is retained and around the trees and so forth. And there's a lot of detail within the rocks itself. Again, a lot of that was just pulled out in post, but I also used ADOX's ADOTech developer with this negative, which creates a flatter negative with CMS20 than any other developer out there. This next one is of a moose, and there is tons of tonal range in this image. HP5 Plus has tons of tonal range out of the box no matter what you do with it, and if you develop it well, you can really make the most of it as a raw file. This last one for black and white was on T-Max 100, and it's not an exciting photo, but what I want to point out is that you can see here in the left side, this shot was taken in full sun. Those bushes on the left are in full sun. Inside of that burned out tree where the smoke is still coming out of it, that was in full dark shade. The inside of that tree was black from soot and being burned. Yet in this image, you can make out details, lots of them, in the area that is within the sunlight, as well as a lot of the tonal gradations in what, even to my eye when I took this shot, was just a plain black interior to this tree. So, as well as the smoke. And T-Max 100 has a ton of dynamic range as it is. Being able to pull even more of it out with a raw file is a great level of editing capability for you if you're shooting it in any format. These are all 35 millimeter, by the way, just to reiterate. This is a lot of detail for a 35 millimeter negative. Let's take a look here at some color images. These are all slides. I don't use this technique for C41, I just let the lab scan it. This was Fuji Provia 100, and you can see here the colors in this image pop. It's pretty high contrast. Provia 100's pretty high contrast. But the reds, the blues, the greens, everything in here really pops. And the reason for this is because this was scanned with a full spectrum bulb. This right here is the reason that you want a full spectrum light, whether it's the sky or a light bulb. If this was, let's say, an incandescent bulb, all of the blues would look brown and muddy. So if you are using this for slides, it is imperative to have full spectrum to get the best color out of your slides. This next one here was taken on E100. Actually, these next three were all taken on Ektachrome 100. This shot was incredibly high contrast. There's dark shade in the foreground, sunny 16 standard daylight in the midground past that tree along the ridge of those hills, and then sky. And scanning this, when I got the scans back from the lab for this, which I didn't keep because they were not up to snuff, the sky was completely blown out. It wasn't anything with the lab. A flatbed scanner or a drum scanner will have a lot of trouble pulling this much dynamic range out of a slide. So here we have deep shadows in the foreground, full sun on the clouds in the background, and the sky is only somewhat blown out. That's the power of being able to edit a raw file from an image. Again, Ektachrome 100, And here we can see we've got a nice range of muted colors, and some of this was an editing post and choice to have the red pop and then the blues and greens be a little bit muted. But I think it was also a cloudy day, or a partly cloudy day, looking at the mountains anyway, that backs that up. But what I want to point out here is less the colors and more the amount of detail. All of these sample images were digitized with my Pentax K3. That's a 24 megapixel sensor. So there is all kinds of image detail with a sensor like that that can be found when you're working with a raw file from a slide, especially a slide like Ektachrome 100 that delivers really good image quality as it is. For our last Ektachrome 100 shot, we have this butterfly. This was taken indoors. And again, this is one where you can just see the way that the colors just come alive with this method. And really, this is what you can expect if you felt line your macro tubes and you have a closed system, which means no light can get in between the negative and the sensor. And if you do that, that sets you up to have the best color transmission when you shine a full spectrum light source through that negative. This last one was Fuji Velvia 50. And again, you can see here, there's good dynamic range by slide film standards, where the lizard there, you can make out details on it even though the lighting coming from above it, the light was above and behind. So the closer part of the lizard there was in shadow comparatively. And editing this in RAW, dropping the highlights and boosting the shadows, allows a lot of the quality of the negative to be reproduced. This isn't making the negative look like something it isn't. It's taking the negative and creating a digital file that replicates what the negative would look like if it were being projected onto a screen. And that's the goal with this technique. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.